It's ding ding, 2 men in a ring. We put pride in your stride and a quiver in your liver. You want 'em, we've got 'em, coming to you. Loud and proud, he's the biggest, he's the baddest. It's Mr. Gavin Davis on the Gavin Davis Podcast Show.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Gavin Davis Podcast featuring my co-host, Dave Bruff. Today, we've got an amazing guest, plenty of history coming at you today. Our guest today is a lead member of the British Judo Association National Kata Group. He is also a British Judo Association Level 3 senior coach, senior examiner. He is a national kata judge and national senior kata examiner. He is a former international player, a multiple national kata medalist. He is also the author of several books and articles on judo with particular emphasis on its historical aspects and kata. Me and Dave want to give a warm welcome to the podcast, Mr. Llyr Jones.
Afternoon.
Thank you for coming on, Llyr.
I'm delighted to be here.
What I'm going to do to get everything going, I'm going to hand you over to Dave, and we're just gonna go with it, mate. We're going to shoot from the hip.
Okay, fire away.
Okay, great to see you, Claire. I think just before we get into the questions, I'll just mention Claire and myself have done some work together. We collaborated on a recent article on judo history and kata and related to jiu-jitsu that will be coming out very shortly. So I've had the opportunity to work with Claire before, which was fantastic. So I think we have a schedule. Shall we just get stuck into the questions?
Yeah, I guess I've seen that, the great set of questions, and look forward to talking about it.
Okay, well, I think it'd be good to start if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your martial arts journey, where it started and where you've been.
Yeah, so I started learning judo as most people do in my local club in West Wales when I was 17 years old, after I passed my driving test and was able to get myself to the club. So the quite a small club with the mats that you sort of put down and took up at the end of every practice, and just sort of immediately loved it. From sort of there, I sort of worked my way up through the grades, went to university, fought at the various university championships and tournaments, took a couple of team medals there, then sort of found myself on sort of the Welsh national squad and sort of represented Wales at a number of international tournaments. Highlights perhaps being the pre-Olympic tournament in the United States in Colorado Springs, 1992, and I also did the Swiss Open as well. I then perhaps had the dream fulfilled of every sort of judo player, where I was able to go and live and work in Japan, and I was able to sort of train at the Kodokan, sort of the global center and the original home of judo.
Okay, brilliant. So what I want to say is with that here is, I had the opportunity to go to Japan in 2017. Can you just go a little bit more into detail about your experiences in Japan and what age you went out there?
Yeah, so I went to Japan in 92, 93. So I was about sort of 24, 25 when I was out there. I went there with work, and sort of the first thing I did was find a judo club. You know, the Kodokan was in Tokyo, was one place where I trained, but I also sort of joined a number of sort of what they call machi dojos, which are sort of small, essentially sort of family-run dojos in sort of more provincial kind of cities. So I was able to train in two machi dojo in a city called Fujisawa, which is about 30 miles south of Tokyo. Yeah. One called the Doyukai, one called Ishii Dojo, named after Ishii Sensei, and there were about sort of 20 people there, sort of all black belts at the same time. And then I used to go to the Kodokan on the Saturday, where essentially it's like an open mat. And I think the big difference, I thought, from between sort of training in judo in the UK and training in Japan was there's very little structure to the training in Japan. You sort of turn up when you can, you sort of do your own warm-up, your own uchikomi, your own practice. And then you just get set in to randori, which is a free practice or sparring. And you do that about 3 or 4 minutes, then you agree to change. You can sit off, have a break, then find the next one. So there's not so much what I did like classes, as people perhaps understand a judo class to be.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And how would you compare the standard of judo or the randori you were doing in the UK compared to what you experienced at the Kodokan?
I would say that the lower grade, below third dan, I would say that it tends to be stronger players in the UK. Most Japanese people tend to get their first dan, their first black belt when they're in senior high school. So they're about 15 or 16 years old. People tend to get it later in the UK after a longer period of training. So I think the physicality and the physical strength of UK players would be higher, but I would say that the technique level of the Japanese players would be much, much higher. And then once you're above third dan or more, then I think you've got very, very high technical standards. And I think what I found in Japan as well, there was more emphasis on the precision of the technique rather than just getting a score and finishing that off with power.
So I noticed from your bio that you also lived in France.
Yeah.
And of course, France is, after Japan, is probably the next major judo country, isn't it? How was training in France?
I would say the training in France is the closest you can get to training in Japan without being in Japan. I trained at a club which was run by a gentleman called Daniel Parisette, who was the younger brother of Bernard Parisette, who was the last person to defeat Anton Giesing in a judo competition. Again, very, very high technical standards, and I would say you've also got the physical strength as well in France, but a real emphasis on technique and a lot of people training. The classes in France are slightly more structured. I think they'd be more recognizable to people who go to a judo class in the UK. So you start off with your warm-ups, your exercises, training in individual techniques, and then you have the randori to finish off the class, finish off the day.
Okay. And you mentioned some of your highlights before, but you're also you're quite academic, aren't you, Claire? You do quite a lot of research around judo, and you're involved with the Kano Society, and is it the iDojo research unit? I mean, could you expand a little on those areas of interest?
Yeah, sure. So the Kano Society was a group essentially set up by a number of judoka, very senior judoka, people like Sid Hoare, people like Richard Dickey Bowen, people like Stan Brogan. Many of them are no longer with us. They were not necessarily happy with the way the direction that judo was going. So perhaps elements of the traditional training had been lost. So some of the people, the exchange between the UK and Japan, particularly people going over to Japan to train in all aspects of judo and becoming permanent students at the Kodokan, that had been lost. And they were concerned about the way that judo was going, and they wanted to set up a little grouping to try and preserve what judo was like when they first started doing judo. And that would have been going back to the 50s and the 60s. And the Kano Society over time has morphed from having a practical component to it to being purely like an online society. They produce a bulletin every quarter, which I edit, which is quite similar to what the Budokai quarterly bulletin used to be, with articles about the historical and the cultural components of judo, but also some technical aspects as well, and of course kata. The iDojo is a group set up by Professor Mike Callan, who's an academic associated with the International Judo Federation. He teaches at the UK university, but he's been involved in educational programs with the European Judo Union and the International Judo Federation. and it's for people that are sort of doing postgraduate degrees and PhDs and masters in judo. It's a research portal where you can sort of publish papers and publish articles and sort of conduct online research.
Interesting. So just before we start moving on, I just want to go back to the point you made on Japan.
Yeah.
With regard of the open mat scenario. So a lot of BJJ clubs, so I'll use like House of Jiu-Jitsu, for example. We would train all week. We'd have structured classes. Yeah. And then on a Saturday, we would have an open mat where people practically come in when they want. They leave when they want. They come in, they warm up at their own pace, and then they join in for a roll or you know, a grapple. In Japan, how do they teach the technical elements of what you're trying to achieve in an open mat scenario if most of the sessions are open mat?
Well, lots of Japanese schools do judo. You tend to have a choice between doing sort of Aikido or judo in a Japanese school. Yeah. So a lot of the technique gets sort of taught in that kind of environment. Right. The Kodokan has structured classes in the international division. If people come from overseas and they want to learn judo, they've essentially got like a fast track program to get them up to black belt standard. Yeah. And that sort of number of classes, I think, is held sort of twice a week for about 3 or 4 hours an evening in the Kodokan. So that's a means for having sort of technical teaching. But I think as well, you know, they have sort of specialist classes for sort of learning kata as well. But most people who come to a judo club, they are not beginners. If you have people sort of joining as a beginner, particularly like an adult beginner who's had sort of very low experience of judo, somebody's usually allocated to them and sort of helps them show the ropes and stuff. So it's a lot of sort of learning by copying as well.
Okay. I think that's quite interesting. I think that's quite different. That, and what do you think about that, Dave?
I think it is interesting. I think it's kind of like, it sounds a bit like, you know, learning to swim by being thrown into the deep end of the swimming pool, isn't it? You just have to start swimming. You don't have, you know, but it's probably accelerated learning, right? You start learning to fight straight away.
Yeah, that was that's sort of my experience. Sort of was formerly sort of in the 90s. I think that since I've left Japan, I think they've sort of put in place sort of a coach education system and stuff, and sort of structured qualifications and awards and things. So whether it's perhaps more recognizable to what we sort of see here now, perhaps it has changed. Can't really comment on that. The one thing I would say as well is if you sort of do judo in the UK, most classes are sort of partitioned into standing or tachiwaza, throwing techniques, and ground waza, near waza, and they sort of practice. You start off the class, you'd sort of learn some throwing techniques, then you'd switch to learning some groundwork techniques. And even when you're sort of doing your randori, you would have sort of standing randori, then groundwork randori. I think in Japan, you really do not have that. You know, you do your transition from standing to ground when you're sort of doing your randori. They usually have sort of pairs on and pairs off. Somebody sort of goes and stands by you to make sure that the other members of the class don't go crashing into you. And I think that was one of the things I sort of immediately noticed as being different, was not the separation between groundwork and standing work.
Yeah. Okay, so for the benefit of the listeners, what is kata?
Okay, well, kata can mean many, many things, but in the context we're talking about it now, pretty much everything which you sort of do in terms of technique-wise that you decide with your partner, or it's decided beforehand what you're going to do, is kata. When most people think of kata, they think of the techniques, sort of the groups of techniques put together to learn certain principles. I think just before I sort of move on, I think we're sort of talking about kata. It's important to remember as well, there are other Japanese kanji or Japanese characters called kata. Kata can mean shoulder, and kata can also sort of mean one. But the kata we're talking about here is the kanji that translates as forms. So there's sort of pre-decided, choreographed movements to learn and demonstrate certain principles.
Okay.
Just to follow that, so I guess in all martial arts, if you're doing, say, a drill, or like a guard pass in BJJ, for example, Gav.
Yeah.
That could be defined as kata in that sense.
Yeah,
in
definitely.
the most strict interpretation of the word kata, yes, it could. And I have sort of people saying, "Oh, I don't really like kata," because they say that they think of sort of the formal sets of techniques practiced end to end. The counter to that is people have been doing kata from the very first lesson that they start to learn judo because they were doing something which was preordained.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We do like flow rolling. So we'll like roll, I'll pass the guard, let them escape the side control. They'll come up, take top position. They'll do a guard pass. I'll escape the side control. It sounds practically the same as what you're describing, but it's I'm not like stopping them totally doing the technique. I'm allowing them to develop and work their technique. And then what we're doing, then when we go into the sparring element of it, then it's getting pressure tested.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Very, very much the same principles.
Yeah.
So I guess then if we go to a time before judo and to the old jujutsu schools, did they practice kata, and were they practiced in the same way, or were they formal schemes?
They pretty much only practice kata. Because if you sort of think of jujitsu, and by that I sort of mean koryu or old school jujitsu, it often involved weapons, often involved knives, often involved swords, as well as being unarmed. And the purpose of old jujitsu was to prepare you for something which they call shinken shobu. Shinken shobu means a real fight, and after sort of a real fight, you put in brackets to the death. And so kata was a very safe means of practicing and learning the techniques. And it was predominantly the overwhelming most popular or most common element of practicing old school jiu-jitsu was through kata. It was a choreographed practice. Somebody would attack with a knife, somebody would sort of do another move. Somebody would attack with a sword, you would sort of do a move. Somebody would attack with a strangle, you would do a move. So it sort of got sort of traditions going right back to sort of jiu-jitsu.
Okay. So of course, so the founder of judo then, Jigoro Kano, he made it safe by making various adaptations, and randori practice was the main route of practice at that point. Why did he develop kata?
Well, he developed kata when the number of students who were learning judo at the Kodokan, the numbers grew to such a level that he was not able to teach them all personally. So he wanted like a structured curriculum where they would learn the principles of certain throws, certain holds, certain self-defense moves, and he wouldn't be able to teach them personally. So they had this sort of core curriculum. And I think if you sort of think about sort of Nagano kata, that is sort of 15 throws, 5 sets of 3 techniques, hand techniques, hip techniques, leg techniques, sacrifice techniques. And they think you have to practice it end to end, 15 techniques, left and right. When Kano was sort of introducing kata into the Kodokan, you would just sort of pick maybe 2 or 3 out of that kata and practice them. So you'd have that sort of basic grounding in learning the principles of a certain technique. And that's where it sort of came into judo. Kano also brought in some kata, and I talk about Kushiki no kata, which is old school kata, they say, which came from Kito Ryu Jiu-Jitsu, Jiu-Jitsu of Rise and Fall, which is one of the traditional Japanese schools that he learned. He brought that into judo to preserve some of the historical aspects of judo. He also brought in sort of Itsutsu no kata, which is from sort of Tenjin Shinyo Ryu Jiu-Jitsu, so sort of 5 principles. And he sort of preserved some of those historical pieces in jiu-jitsu and from the original kata.
Okay, so the randori no kata were really for improving practice then for the big classes, but the other kata were more to store historical knowledge or to preserve links to the old school jiu-jitsu.
And also sort of, Kano regarded judo as being deriving physical benefit and mental benefit from the practice of attack and defense. and he looked at sort of various aspects of that attack and defense. The Randori no kata is sort of two kata, sort of the Nage no kata, which is the kata of throws, and the Katame no kata, which is the kata of control, done on the ground. The very name Randori no kata, that's what you practice to learn Randori skills.
So how many kata are there in judo? When you describe how many kata there are, could you also maybe describe whether each one relates to a particular type of practice or a particular principle of what Kano was trying to do?
Of course. So the Kodokan would now officially say that there are 10 kata in judo. So there's the two Randori, 10 or 9. So there's the two Randori no kata, Nage no kata, Katame no kata, throws and holds, where you sort of learn self-defense, where you would learn Randori skills. There's sort of two kata then for self-defense skills, Kodokan Goshinjitsu, which basically just means Kodokan self-defense, and that includes attacks against punches, kicks, attack with a gun, attack with a stick, and attack with a dagger. That's a relatively modern kata developed after Kano's death. There's a historical self-defense kata called Kime no kata, which has its roots in old school jujitsu. That's done sort of showing self-defenses against knives, swords, and blows. And that's done standing up and kneeling down. That dates back to Koryu Jiu-Jitsu. You've then got the kata, which are called Ju no kata, which is sort of the kata of flexibility and gentleness, where you can sort of learn gentle self-defense movements, no throwing, no completion. Everything is done to the point of breaking balance. You don't even need a judo suit to practice that kata. You can practice it in everyday clothes. You've then sort of got the ones I mentioned already. It's Itsu no kata and Koshiki no kata, which are the kata designed to preserve the heritage of the old school jujitsu that Kano practiced and built his judo upon. You've then got something relatively new called Kodomo no kata, which basically means a kata for children. That is only about 2 or 3 years old and was sort of developed just to have a structural curriculum to how beginners and children could learn kata. So if you go to the Kodokan website, you will see those kata. There are other katas developed in the Kodokan, and I'll talk about Go no kata, which is sort of the counter kata to Ju no kata. Go means strength, which was developed by Kano, but he didn't like it, but it's still an official Kodokan kata. There is another Kodokan kata called Joshi Goshin Ho, which is a specialty self-defense kata for women. And that's still sort of an official Kodokan kata, but it's not taught that much. There is another kata then called Zeroku Zenyoku Kyumin Taiku, which is sort of the national physical national physical education kata. Just so they've got physical education moves which you do on your own, and some self-defense moves which you do with the partner. So those are the Kodokan kata. Other teachers then, both Japanese and Western, have invented their own kata, and they have sort of various utilities. Perhaps the two I'd refer to would be sort of the two Urawaza kata developed by Kyuzo Mifune and Ito Sensei, both students of kind of high ranking, who show counters to the two Randori no kata. Got other kata then, which sort of have got basically they're just sort of techniques with some protocol at the beginning, at the end. You bow in, you bow off, and you have a set of techniques in the middle, and people have called those katas and labeled them. Go no sen no kata would be one which is sort of very familiar to people in the West in particular. That means sort of preemptive countering kata. Some say it's developed by Waseda University. Not many people in Waseda University know anything at all about it. It was sort of popularized by a gentleman called Kawaishi, who sort of wrote it up in a book called sort of the 7 Katas of Judo. There's katas developed by some of the senior teachers in the British Judo Council, where they sort of put together certain elements of techniques and sort of put them in an order to show certain principles and call them a kata. I think sort of teachers in mainland Europe have developed their own katas as well and sort of published it.
Yeah.
And also, of course, there are other Japanese teachers who sort of created kata to show various principles, which they themselves have sort of a personal celebrity around.
Yeah, me and Dave often talk on this podcast about longevity in training, how that can be developed and not so much experimented on, but taken forward.
Yeah.
I watched a clip on YouTube a couple of years ago regarding of Chuck Norris, right? And Chuck Norris was saying that when he met Elio Gracie was in his late 70s and he was having all problems with his back, and he couldn't actually do much grappling because of the strain and the stress it was putting on his back. So he devised a kata format where he could do key movements and still practice his technique. It sounds that a lot of these katas to me are very similar in the fact that it promotes longevity and it promotes good technique. Would you agree with that?
I certainly think it promotes good technique, because you really are working at sort of the fundamental principles level.
Yeah.
And I think sort of the attacks that you sort of see in kata create the ideal conditions, the ideal set of circumstances for you to apply a technique. So there's certainly those sort of benefits. And of course, because it is a sort of a controlled practice and you know what's coming your way, it is perhaps a very important part of judo in old age as well.
Yeah. It very sounds that way to me as well. Yeah. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think as we're getting older, we're as you say, Gav, we're looking at ways of maintaining longevity in martial arts, and kata-based practice certainly appears a good way to do that.
Yeah.
Over the last 18 months, the Kodokan has lost the 3 10th dan teachers that it had. It lost Daigo Sensei, it lost Abe Sensei, it lost Ozawa Sensei. Daigo Sensei was in his very late 90s. Abe Sensei was nearly 100 years old. He was 99. And Ozawa Sensei was about 96 as well. And up until sort of very, very recently, sort of COVID apart, they were still teaching at the Kodokan summer kata course.
Yeah. I think Elio Gracie was on the mats until about 10 days before he passed away. So there's something to be said in what they're doing in that format, isn't there? They're still on the mats.
It's a safe, controlled way of practicing.
Yeah.
So
Dave.
Just going back to these kata that Kano developed.
Yeah.
Because I guess when Kano developed judo, jiu-jitsu was on its knees, wasn't it, in terms of something that was commonly practiced in Japan. And I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping you can maybe shed some light on it. Of course, there was the Dai Nippon Butokukai, which promoted martial practice in Japan.
Yeah.
And there's a picture of Kano, another famous at the time jiu-jitsu instructors, from 1906, and it was called a kata enclave, which was the standardization of kata. And I've wondered whether other jiu-jitsu schools were then accepting Kano's kata for practice in their schools. What do you have any insight into that event or time?
Well, that conclave was essentially to standardize the kata that the Kodokan would teach. It focused on the 2 randori no kata and on kime no kata. Ju no kata, which is sort of the gentle, flexible movements one, was viewed a little bit too esoteric. They didn't talk too much about that. They talked about kime no kata because that was the one who had sort of the closest roots to jujitsu. The other kata, which I sort of talked about, hadn't sort of really been created yet. Kodokan Goshinjutsu was only created in the 50s, so of course that wasn't there. So it focused very much on sort of the kata, the 2 judo kata, the randori no kata, and on kime no kata that Kano was lifting from jujitsu, and the 2 other kata from jujitsu, which was sort of he left largely unchanged. So it sort of agreed on the standardization of those.
So agreed that they would be practiced by the Kodokan, or did the other jiu-jitsu instructors agree that we will practice those within our school as well?
Well, they had at the Dainippon, well, at the Butoku Den or the Dainippon Butokukai, they also taught judo, because what you had there was sort of the separation with the Kodokan sort of being very much Tokyo centric, and the Dainippon Butokukai being Kyoto centric, and they sort of both had their own judo. They both had their sort of their own promotion standards as well, and the Kodokan recognized Dainippon Butokukai grades. So you could sort of see they almost proceeded in parallel, just sort of given the geographic separation of Kyoto and Tokyo. What you also had as well, jiu-jitsu didn't immediately stop overnight. It was almost like a morphing of jiu-jitsu into judo. But of course, many of the traditional sort of Koryu schools, they sort of still remained as well in Japan, and people practiced those. And I think it was only sort of, you had sort of the shift from, you had sort of the Meiji Reformation, where you sort of had your modern Japan, where sort of the feudal ways of walking around with swords and samurais and knives and stuff, that sort of came to an end. And so judo came to develop and enhanced in that sort of environment. And of course, you're then coming up to sort of post-war Japan, where sort of the Kodokan repositioned itself as an educational establishment, and judo repositioned itself as an educational activity, which is how it was allowed to sort of resume its practice after the war by the Americans.
How do you feel the judo kata is valued in the UK?
I think it's on the up. So I think the group that we've been running and my colleagues in the British Judo Association, we've been doing a huge amount to promote kata. I think there've been more and more kata kind of courses. There's interest in kata, largely fueled by kata competition as well. But many people sort of seeing the benefits of kata in its own right. But I think it's fair to say there was a period where it was at the pretty low ebb. And I think as well, if you're sort of running a judo club, so maybe for 1.5 hours, two times in a week, in the church hall where you have to sort of put the mats up and down, if you haven't got these sort of dedicated facilities that you can access pretty much 24/7, you need to be really judicious about what you sort of practice in your judo class, in your lessons. And quite often, kata practice is something which sort of falls away unless it's sort of specifically needed for particular grading.
Okay.
But I noticed from at least the BJA syllabus, you actually don't need to do very much kata. In terms of the Kodokan kata, you can, and in the judo classes I attend, I don't think I've ever done any.
No, probably not. So first of all, so there was, if you go back, being able to do kata was there in the senior club coach award. When I did mine, you had to know kata, but that's sort of no longer in the coach award syllabus. So finding people who can teach kata and incorporate kata practice into an everyday judo lesson, that's not that straightforward in the UK. And with sort of the time constraints and the syllabus pressure as well, quite often it just doesn't get a feature.
Yeah. So has people's interpretation of what it is or how it's practiced, has that changed, I guess, over time?
I think it's more people's interpretation of what judo is, and I think that sort of change happened when sort of it got accelerated when judo came into the Olympics. So before that, judo was sort of viewed as the martial art. Yes, it's not the martial art; it's the martial way, because it's a do, not a jutsu. But people looked at it that sort of way, and sort of self-defense and things featured in your everyday sort of judo class. But since you started to begin, since you got put into the Olympics, it gradually morphed into almost purely a sports competitive activity. And so perhaps sort of the martial component of it perhaps got diluted, perhaps. And yes, it's a sport, it's a combat sport, it's a martial combat sport, but the outcome is sort of sporting success is what you're sort of looking for, rather than perhaps a more holistic kind of piece. So perhaps that's sort of been behind kata sort of falling down in popularity.
Yeah, it sounds to me. Me and Dave were talking last week about like grassroots, then developing into competition phase, and then developing into like your retirement phase once your competition phase is coming to a close. And it sounds to me that this is so beneficial in grassroots and in retirement phase, and it can be mixed into competition phase as well for like specific details in something you're trying to achieve in competition.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think a lot of people probably wouldn't understand that, because from a grassroots perspective, developing kids and everything and teenagers, like just getting basic footwork, basic grips, slowing everything down, getting your coaching more sharp on certain details. Would you agree with that, Llyr?
I would, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what do you think of the judo kata in competition?
I think it was not what kata was created for, but I think, you know, being able to win medals in kata competitions has sort of catalyzed, you know, a renewed interest in kata. So I think there are more people doing kata now as a direct benefit of kata competition. So it's very hard to object to.
Yeah.
And I think having had sort of kata competitions as well, the technical excellence of kata has improved as a result of that. But I think what I tend to think of it is, how can kata improve my judo, not how can I win a medal in kata. So it just depends what your goal is. I think the outcome tends to be the same.
Yeah.
You know, you do better kata, you will have better judo. So it just depends what the motivation for that training is and what you sort of view the outcome.
When you're judging,
Yeah.
you don't need to go too in detail with this if you don't want to, but are you looking at pure technical elements, or is there other things that you're looking at?
So there are certain elements as to how sort of a technique is positioned in kata, how it's set up, where Tori Anuka's hands need to be. There's sort of certain things that you're sort of looking at in the kata,
Yeah.
but you're also sort of looking for, you know, the breaking of the balance, the timing, the opportunity. All of that has to be right as well. So I'm looking for good judo first and foremost, but I'm also looking for the kata specific elements to be present.
Good.
Just following that, Llyr, is there a danger that competition could change kata? You know, in the way that competition judo is constantly altered to make it more appealing or make it more exciting as a spectator sport. Is that a potential risk?
I think there are changes, because you do need to be able to judge things to a certain standard. If you sort of go onto YouTube and if you sort of look at Kodokan Goshin Jitsu, the first demonstration there from 1956, the practitioner is a guy called Kenji Tomiki, who's as much an Aikido player as he was a judo player. He's got very free-form, unstructured self-defense. Yes, he knows what attack is coming and he knows what defense he's going to do, but it's sort of very free-flowing, very unregimented. If you look at Kodokan Goshin Jitsu now, it's very, very, very structured. Why is that structure there? Because if you judge something, you need a standard to judge it against. And so perhaps we're sort of seeing certain elements of kata techniques being standardized to enable them to be easier to judge. But when you're sort of judging kata, the most important thing is the best kata pair wins.
It's always done in pairs, yeah?
Always done in pairs.
Yeah, okay.
You have Tori and Uke. Uke is the person who attacks. Tori is the person who essentially defends and does the decisive technique.
Yeah. Sound. And if they were to win, do they win as a pair?
Yes.
But, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's not just the Tori that wins. Okay. Dave, what have you got there left for?
Yeah.
Clear?
So have the judo kata influenced other martial arts?
I can't really think of anything. I think the closer one would be, I talked about Kodokan Goshin Jitsu, so that was developed by a panel of masters at the Kodokan to develop a self-defense technique for modern times. Kenji Tomiki, of course, formed his own style of Aikido, Tomiki Aikido. And so there's a crossover there. What you'll see, many of the techniques in Tomiki Aikido are also the same techniques that you find them in Kodokan Go Shinjutsu, but that sort of comes back to the individual Kenji Tomiki and his sort of technical understanding.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, so much of judo, the practice of it as a do, so it's a kind of moral, physical education, a way of getting better or making yourself better. And the belt system, the Dan grade system, so much of what judo introduced is adopted by pretty much all martial arts, I think.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if there are other elements and threads that are adopted. So what do you think the future has for judo kata? How do you see it developing?
I think sort of a similar future to all of judo. Really, you still have to sort of establish a continued relevance in sort of the modern digital enabled age, and I think just sort of thinking about kata, you could say that the link between sort of judo's past, present, and future is in the accurate teaching of kata, because you've got a consistent thread running through it, which preserves the technical principles. Yes, if you sort of think of seoinage, or a back carry throw, which people call a shoulder throw, the variations you've sort of seen of that, in competition, from sort of your drop seoinage, where you sort of go down on your knees, sort of doing cross grips, from doing sort of double-handed grips. It's evolved the whole time. Judo's a living thing. If you have the kata, you've got go back to that. You've sort of got the fundamental principles and the ideal circumstance, set of situations for applying, the back carry throw, the seoinage. So you can almost have that sort of consistent thread running through it. And perhaps you can just, if your technique's not working, you can sort of maybe have a glance to how it was sort of done in kata, see if there's anything there that you can look at, see if there's anything there you can pick up on. Because I think if you look at contest judo, techniques come and go, they fall into fashion, quite often dependent upon what the favorite technique of one of the great champions of the day particularly happens to be. It's gone from being Tayatoshi, which is a body drops technique. It's gone from being uchimata, which is sort of like an in the thigh throw. It's gone from being sort of seoinage to a shoulder throw. It's gone from being osotogari, the rear throws. So I think, you have a lot of techniques looking at the particular variations and favorites that see success in competition in any given time, but you can sort of look to the kata and you can perhaps see other elements. You have this sort of consistency. So I think.
Okay. So it's just to follow that. I think, I mean, I've read when the Eastern Europeans and Sambo started competing with judo, that introduced something different. There were different techniques or different ways of doing things that the Western and Japanese then had to deal with and adapt. And I suppose as different nations with different fighting styles, maybe in Brazil now, people coming with very strong newaza or different ways of executing newaza techniques. So judo, and the rule changes, judo is constantly evolving and changing. Are the techniques and the way they were practiced in the kata still as applicable to modern judo?
Well, I think judo is consistently altering its rule set. So for sort of sports competitive judo, I think the International Judo Federation is really, really keen to have differentiation between judo and other forms of wrestling, because of course you're competing for a space in the Olympic Games. There probably could be only so many slots for grappling type sports in the Olympic Games. And so judo needs to be sort of differentiated with its very own, very distinct, very clear identity. And that is based upon throwing, essentially. If you sort of look at Nagano kata, the third technique in Nagano kata is kataguruma. The style of kataguruma, or shoulder wheel, which you sort of do in in judo, in the Nagano kata, that is not allowed in sports competition rules because you're grabbing the trouser leg. You're not allowed to grab the trouser leg under IJF contest rules. So what does that mean for that particular technique? It means that sort of modern contest players have looked at the principles and found a way of being able to execute the technique without that sort of rule violation of grabbing the trouser leg. So you will sort of see throws come in and out of sort of the contest rules while still remaining in the kata. And people ask questions, well, why do I have to do kata guruma in Nagano kata where I can't do it in competition? And that's a tricky question to answer, perhaps. But if you look at some of the techniques in the kata as well, you do a lot of them in response to blows. So if you're doing seoinage, you do that in response to a blow. If you're doing ukigoshi, you do it in response to a blow. If you're doing some of the sacrifice techniques, you do it in response to a blow. And of course, you can't have the taniwaza or blows in sports competition judo. So you get all these sort of questions of sort of continued relevance as well. But I still think it's important.
Yeah. Okay. Right, Dave, is there anything else you want to go through with Llyr?
I've just got one more point. If I just go back to the judo kata competition, was the kata competition development a Japanese development or was it a Western development? And if it was Western, how did the Japanese view judo kata competition?
My understanding, and I could be wrong, but I don't think that I am, was that the first kata competition was organized in the UK. I think the Japanese, from my experience, were relatively slow to adopt kata competition. Kata competition was something which was promoted by the International Judo Federation, not the Kodokan. There has been a Kodokan kata competition, which was very, very successful because everybody wanted to go over to the Kodokan and and practice their kata there. But I think Japanese kata pairs now are very, very successful in international kata competition. So I think it's here to stay.
Okay. Anything else? We're going to start bringing the podcast to a close, Llyr. Anything else that with kata, with judo, anything else you want to discuss that you think that we've missed or we haven't quite touched on that you'd like to?
Yeah, I think kata it's but one part of judo. Randori and shiai competition are equally as important. I think for me it would be a real shame if that sort of traditional training element of kata, did not survive modern judo. I think if you look at sort of karate lessons, if you look at sort of aikido lessons, kata training is a fundamental part of all lessons in those disciplines, and it would be nice to get it the same in judo.
Okay. Anything to add, Dave?
No, just to say thank you very much for coming on, Llyr. It's been really insightful, and it's been great to meet you.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I just want to close the podcast and same again, thanking Llyr for coming on. Your knowledge and your expertise in this field, to be fair, we've had you on an hour. That was a privilege to sit through and listen to a lot of that. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on, because from an educational piece, I'm blown away by that. So I think Dave will agree with me. Thank you very much for sharing all that with us.
You're too kind.
No, genuinely, if it wasn't true, I wouldn't say it. Trust me. Thank you for coming on, and we'll look at getting you on again. We'll stay in touch, and we'll look at getting you on again in the future. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Right, everyone. We're bringing the podcast to a close. Thanks for listening in. Keep rolling. Keep enjoying your training, and keep up the hard work.